And I'll be talking about product feedback loops for the next, 15 to 20 minutes. Hopefully I'll be on time.
We get time.
I'd like to keep this interactive, so feel free to interrupt me at any point. Steve gave a quick overview on Lean Startup. I'm hopefully going to complement a lot of what he said. There's a little bit of overlap, but I think it's all good. So I saw the hands up before, and how many people were or knew about Lean Startups? How many people here are in a startup or working on a startup? Okay. All right. So let's get started. So the ultimate goal in a startup or in a new product launch is building something people want. But you can't do that unless you truly understand your users. Here's a slide I've been following Kathy Sierra for a long time. I don't know how many people here have seen the slide before. Kind of with a show of hands. Yeah, it's several years old. But this is Kathy Sierra's attempt to essentially walk you through the kick-ass curve, which shows how users progress through this user cycle or the user life cycle. So essentially, when you first launch a product, it sucks, and you're going to have a lot of users that are not too happy about it. And what you need to do is move them from what she describes as the suck threshold to the passion threshold, where they start kicking ass. And the quicker you can do that, the higher your chances of success. So the left curve is good, the right one is bad. So when you first launch a product, lots of things can and will go wrong. Many of these things aren't what we even traditionally consider part of the product. You might have the best features, but you have problems with either your positioning, your design, or your pricing. Well, guess what? All those three things are very much part of the product. So in order to build something users want, you have to tackle the full product and understanding the user life cycle helps you actually take that on more iteratively than taking it as a whole. And we'll see some examples of that. So here's an agenda of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to start by talking about what this life cycle looks like and how you map that for your product. We'll talk about where you start in the process, which types of experiments you run, and then we'll look at ways for troubleshooting this life cycle. Any questions so far? Okay. Let's get going. So every product has a user life cycle. The user life cycle essentially walks you through the path the user takes from when they first hit your website to sign up, and then eventually and hopefully becoming an engaged and passionate customer or user. This is actually something I took from Joshua Porter's website. He covers a usability blog, goes by the name of Bocardo on Twitter and bocardo.com, and he has a lot of great stuff on design UX with a more metrics type of focus. So this user lifecycle can also be viewed as a conversion funnel. And some of you who follow Lean Startup will recognize this picture, which is Dave McClure's startup metrics. And how many people here have seen this before? Okay, so I'll walk down through it just a little bit. So the startup metrics essentially kind of crystallizes what a startup needs to measure for progress. There are 5 basic events or basic actions. The first one talks about acquisition. So this is users finding you, users hitting your website, for instance. The second one is activation, which is them signing up and actually using your product. At that point, you have an activated user. And then retention, something Steve talked about, is do users come back and use the product beyond that first time? And some of the more latter goals are revenue. Do you make money directly from the user or indirectly? And then referral, do they tell others about this product? So those are kind of the 5 basic things from a metric sense. They map pretty closely to what Joshua has over here. His is more, I kind of like this picture more because it kind of more connects at a user-centric level. It's more psychological. It shows you some of the hurdles that you go through at each of these stages, and you can design for those type of things, which is kind of his intent in showing this. But some of the things are not very measurable. So for example, when you hit passionate user, how do you measure a passionate user? If you come to this picture, Dave tells you very clearly when you've got passion, you've got people who pay for your product, and you've got people who would tell others about your product. So that kind of is how I differentiate the two. This kind of makes things more actionable and more measurable. So once you've understood kind of the five actions or 5 stages, the next step to kind of map this to your application is to take the behaviors in your application and map them to these metrics. So as I said, acquisition is more like the website visit, and activation could be the actual sign-up process. Retention is the act of them coming back, so it could be when they log back in. Or some people have a more stricter definition, which makes retention look more like engagement. It's when they do a key activity, and that's what Steve was talking about. When they actually create go through the whole process would be a key activity. So you're not just tracking pure retention, but you're tracking more engagement. And then revenue is, I guess, pretty clear when they purchase something or you make money. And then referral is when they actively go out of their way to invite others or tell others about the product through an affiliate program or just through a share button that you have on your site. Any questions? Okay. So now we're going to look and see where we actually start in this process. So looking at this picture again, the first objective of a startup or for a product is to make sure that you're building something people want, and that's directly tied into, did they have a good first experience and did they come back? Those are the key metrics that directly map to that of these 5. Now this is a funnel, so you have to start from the top down, and we'll come to acquisition here in a second, but I will talk a little bit about revenue and referral first. Without actually building something that people either come back to, trying to spend a whole lot of effort on building virality or building referral is a form of making startup speed, and something that could really be deferred. If you were racing to launch, you would actually do without your referral step at this stage. The same thing goes with the revenue. Some of you probably follow 37 Signals, and one of the things they talk about is if you have a 30-day free trial and you're getting to launch, don't go get a merchant account first, and don't go and try to figure out your payment systems. You should be so lucky if you have that problem. So launch first, and you have 30 days to kind of backfill that. So that's another one of those things that kind of helps prioritize things. So once you understand how users or once you understand this user life cycle, it helps put priority on what are the things you should be working on and what you should be tweaking first. So acquisition obviously is at the top of the funnel, so you have to have some means of acquiring users that you think are your target demographic. Now over here, I'll kind of say that it's, again, important not to go crazy here. You definitely need to get enough traffic, but just enough traffic to learn. So there have been lots of stories. In my last product, I had a file sharing product, and I spent a lot of money just up front on AdWords and advertising on the Deck, which is an influential designer, developer-based ad network, which is very expensive. And sure, it drove a lot of traffic, but the product really sucked. So it was just all money down the drain, because we got lots of people in, and they all hit the same all the same chasms and all just disappeared. I would have learned the same thing with a fraction of that traffic. So again, it's very important there to make sure you are getting the right traffic, but just enough so that you can support learning to where you can get that product from that suck threshold to the kick-ass threshold, and then you're ready to start kind of cranking up on there. Questions?
So and in your case, do you do that with like put on tables like A/B testing kind of thing, or do you just look for where are people falling off in the process, or how do you kind of define?
Sure. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is right after launch. So I believe that, so if you follow kind of a lean startup or customer development process, you have done some level of customer validation in a verbal setting. So you've interviewed customers and you've identified what are the top 3 problems you should address. And once you launch, the first thing that you have to do is make sure that that your value proposition, your unique value proposition, is coming through. So I don't believe in adding a lot of new features right at the beginning. You really want to make sure that what you have, what your customers said their problems were, are being met. So it's not so much by necessarily doing a lot of alternative testing, but there is A/B testing for some of the things that we'll kind of see a little bit later. So there are, when we talk about activation, that includes the sign-up flow. a lot of the things that Steve was talking about. If you do see a metric where people are dropping off, then you want to kind of address that. And is it really an A/B test scenario, or is there really just a problem that you're so some of those are done. But I do kind of refrain from adding new features for a while, so you can make sure that your core, the reason you built the product actually doesn't get diluted is the purpose of that. And kind of mapping the same priority to this is just kind of for convenience, going back to Joshua Porter's model. It again shows that where you kind of want to focus. You want to focus on the point after sign up to the point where you have a regular user, not so much a passionate user, that comes a little bit later, but just you want to make sure that people have a good first experience and they're coming back to your product. Those are the first sets of metrics that you want to start measuring. The passion will come with them referring and paying for your product, and that will be coming shortly. So I guess now what I want to do is kind of walk through how you would troubleshoot. So basically what we've talked about is we've identified these metrics, or these key metrics. Now we talk about some of the steps of actually troubleshooting the process and finding problems and walking through that. So just like Steve, I love metrics. Although what I've kind of found more recently is that when you're first starting, there are some shortcomings with metrics. So I've learned to love customers more, at least I try to, or learn the people behind the metrics more, and we'll see that. So again, when you first launch, lots of things do go wrong, and metrics help, but they're not the full answer. They can tell you what's going wrong, but they can't tell you why those things are happening. For that, you have to be able to connect metrics to actual people, and you've got to be able to reach out and talk to those people. So my last product was a downloadable product, and I've been a long-time user of KISS metrics, and I've used that to instrument all these metrics. And these are made-up numbers, but we still had we had something close to this where there was a huge cliff from the number of users that signed up to the number of users that downloaded the application and even logged in. So we knew that something was happening from the point that they signed up either in the install process, either in the motivation process. They might have said, I don't want to deal with the downloadable app. We didn't know what was going on. So this is a case where the metric was clearly telling us that something bad was happening, and we were there spinning our wheels and trying to come up with one hypothesis after another to try to figure out why. And we did all kinds of split tests and A/B experiments with the installer, and we did things with the sign-up flow, and eventually what ended up happening is we just started running more and more usability tests and slowly uncovered some of the problems that most of our users were using. What I wish I'd had was a way to take the drop-offs and turn them to actual people, so I could actually email them or message them and say, we noticed you dropped off, what's going on here? And we'll talk about this a little bit. You would expect people to, when they run into issues, immediately pick up the phone. Actually, I'll save that story for a little bit later. The second problem with metrics is that right after you launch, you don't have enough traffic to afford waiting for statistically significant results. And so what I've kind of learned to do or taught myself to do is to kind of have a two-phase approach to validation. With everything that we put out there, whether it's a new feature, it's a new pricing or landing page, we kind of go through two phases of validation. One is qualitative and one is quantitative. So we validate qualitatively first, and then we let the data come in, trickle in over time, until it's statistically significant to verify that quantitatively. And the best way to kind of show that is to actually look at an example. So when it's probably pretty dark, but you need to read the text. So when we first launched, this was a photo sharing application that was targeted at moms. And most of us being technical, we kind of went with the first original tagline of this being the fastest way to share your photos, and that was the first one we put. They were in here. I think the first thing that we did is we had 3 or 4 variations of these pages, and we immediately went happily created a Google website optimizer experiment. We threw some money at AdWords and stumbled upon to drive some traffic, and we found that we basically found there was some traffic coming through, and by the end of week 1, we had just a trickle of traffic coming through. And part of the reason there was that our audience, which is moms, don't actually search on Google for photo sharing sites. They get this more through referrals and from friends. But even then, I mean, even if you could drive some traffic, we'd be able to get an idea of if people even prefer one over the other. Kind of in parallel, we actually started doing customer discovery, and we showed variations of these pages to everyone we talked to. And it was very clear that the second one connected more emotionally than the first one. And in retrospect, it's easy because it had the right words that connected with them, and it had the right imagery that connected with them. But this was an experiment that we ran, and qualitatively, we got a very, very strong signal within a week that the second version was going to win. And I think it took Google Website Optimizer several weeks to declare the same result, the same winner. So the point here is that with that two-phase validation, you can go out and look for strong signals. And there you're actually looking for strong negative signals. So if you have a hypothesis and you put it out there, and you do a usability test with either a customer or with someone you bring in, and they immediately give you a strong signal that this is not going to work, we would kill that hypothesis immediately. So there's a very good likelihood that it's not going to work in the grand scale as well. Now, if you get a strong signal that from them that they like this and it is going to work, that doesn't necessarily imply that it will work statistically either. So we leave that kind of running, but that's kind of the permission to keep that hypothesis around, essentially. So that's where that two-phase validation comes in. It's good for weeding out a lot of stuff, but the strong signal, and if we kind of get a middle signal, then we also tend to not add more features if we don't have to. Any questions on that? Okay. So, as I mentioned, one of the key things over here is actually getting customers to talk to you, because they are the ones who hold kind of all the answers, and there are numerous techniques. Customer development goes through a whole process of even before you build things to try to basically tell a story to your customers about the problems you're solving, show them screenshots, show them mock-ups. So there's a whole process there. There's a whole conversation. And aside from that, making yourself very accessible. These are all things I think people do, is putting their email everywhere. The 800 number was new for me, and I think a lot of people in this room might be in that same boat. So I used to be, a technical founder, developer, and did not really want to have direct conversation with customers. So I would rather have them, email me or go to some website and fill out a form somewhere and get satisfaction, all those things. Vote on these things, and I'll fix your features. I'll understand what features you want. And I've kind of gone a full 180 with the new product, where now I actually have an 800 number on every page of the site, and it's tied to my mobile phone. So that when that phone rings, I'd like to be the first person to talk to customers. And it's there's kind of this fear that you're going to get bombarded with support requests, and you're going to get bombarded with angry customers, and it's actually quite the opposite. The phone does not ring nearly as much, and usually there are a lot of most of the problems that I've encountered have been fairly easy to address even on the phone, or they've been more kind of more exploratory questions where they have more questions, they didn't get something on the site, and all those things are great feedback to get, because they're things that you can address on the website and kind of keep refining your positioning. And so one day that will probably not be scalable for me to do, but in the early days, that's something that I decided that I was going to be the one answering the phone, and I still do that. The other thing is weekly usability tests. I think Steve also mentioned kind of the importance of that. And we either use user testing if we can get people in-house to do a test, or we will try to get at least one or two people kind of cycle through Craigslist or their kind of other resources. Or many times what we still do is if you know the customer discovery process, we keep doing that, and so in that process we have kind of modified that to be somewhat of a usability test. So we'll see if this customer is interested in trying the product, and then we'll just give them the page and say, why don't you sign up right here? And we don't say anything, and we kind of just watch them do a usability test in front of us. And then the offer incentives piece, there are some, so our products had had a free trial period, and so at the end of the trial period, if we were going to lose this customer anyways, we might as well give them some freebies to understand why they weren't using the product. You know, was it the product that they liked, like the pricing? So we would kind of offer the product for free, and if they didn't really like the product, they would say, I don't care for the product, and we try to offer them something, either a t-shirt or a $20 gift card, just to get them on the phone for 15 minutes so we could understand why they're not staying on. But these are all low-hanging fruit. These users were motivated enough to go through the sign-up process, to download the application, to go through the trial period, and then all of a sudden just disappear. We want to know why they're leaving. So that's kind of another kind of key point of being able to follow up not just the good parts of the life cycle, but also where people are dropping off. One other thing, one other useful tactic for collecting feedback is making the feedback process that simple. You'll see a number of kind of variations. All of these are like inline in the application. So again, rather than providing a feedback button and expect users to kind of click that and go type all this prose about what they're experiencing. Some users do that, and again, there are different user motivations. Our users did not. So we wanted to create very simple kind of inline messaging. The last one is actually a screenshot from KISS Insights, which is the guys who also put out KISS Metrics. And they provide a kind of a JavaScript-powered way to ask questions on your website that are inline, and they can be timed so that they're appropriate questions based on where the user is at that on the page or at that particular time. But even this, what we found is that most of our users that were having a good experience were filling out these, but those that were not weren't filling these out. And so and it's kind of, I guess it's kind of understandable. At this point, the users were motivated enough to try the product, but they're not invested in it in any means. And so the first opportunity they get to kind of bail out, they're going to leave, and they're not going to ever come back. And so that is a critical period where they weren't giving us feedback, so we had to supplement this with other ways of understanding. So the download problem that I was describing was exactly one of those. Many of them didn't even have a chance to get to this page because they had an issue with the installer, and they had no recourse. And of course, we had some people that were doing there are a lot of user errors where they would download the application and expect it to kind of magically come up. So they were not clicking on the installer or running the installer. So we've had kind of a whole gamut of different symptoms that we have diagnosed over time, but the idea is that not everyone even gets to this point, and most of them will not take the effort, especially in that first user experience that has to be seamless. So what we had to do is we started building this homegrown system where we began to collect both diagnostic and marketing level data. And this screen kind of shows you some of that. The diagnostic data helped us troubleshoot issues that we were having with the activation flow, and the marketing data helped us focus our attention. So I'll kind of just walk through this a little bit. So on our sign-up form, we only collect the email address. We run all emails through a service like Rapleaf, which some of you might know of. They can essentially take an email address and map it into a social profile. And so we get to see something about who these users are, which is, apart from being fun, is it kind of helps you understand the demographics of your user. So again, our product was targeted at busy moms with kids, and if we had someone like this show up, clearly it's someone who's either curious, but I do have a blog which I get a lot of people that are just curious to see what kind of products I'm building or testing, and so you get a lot of curious kind of onlookers, or you get just kind of noise, and so it helps you also. It basically also helps you to essentially figure out how much focus you need to put on your users. And I guess, and this data over time becomes very valuable because where we're going with this system is we are able to kind of mine this data at an aggregate level. And so I can run a report over time to see who my most active users are. And if I find out that they actually end up not being moms, but they end up being kind of this other demographic, which could be photographers or wedding photographers or whatever, that's a way to kind of discover alternate segments that you may not have even thought you were targeting. So it's just interesting anyways, and then just getting the social media stuff is very powerful too, because if you ever start running campaigns on Twitter or Facebook, you get to find out who are your most influenced, who are your biggest influencers of the users you have. Now the left-hand side kind of summarizes all the application level stuff. So we show a funnel on the top so you can see how far this user got in that funnel. In the middle, you have the set of properties about this user, so things that would be helpful for us. And this is a downloadable app. I'd like to know if they were on Mac versus Windows, things at that level. And down below is we actually collect a lot of the detailed events that Steve was also talking about. So it's down to anything you want to track. So at a sign-up event, I want to know everything about this user's machine that would be useful in helping diagnose a problem. Because one of the things we found that even when we did get some brave customers on the phone or sending us emails saying, yes, we'll help you, I'm motivated to help you troubleshoot, the first 1 or 2 conversations were all about collecting environment data. So we were asking, what browser are you using, operating system, and then send us these logs. And very soon, even the best intentioned customers get worn down, and they're just not interested in supporting us. So any way that we could do this in the background was hugely powerful. And so with this, we've even seen patterns where we've had a case where we were getting a kind of a huge drop-off, and we looked at across users, and we found out that users with a particular OS were having this issue, or with a particular browser were having this issue. And so we went and reran our test there, and sure enough, we found the problem, fixed it, and then we were able to go back to those set of users because we knew who they were and say, kind of apologize for the mistake and see if they'd come back. And some of them, if you kind of send the right story saying, this was an issue, we found it, and we were early, and we'd love to have you back, you'd be amazed how many would actually kind of see that positively. Go ahead.
What was the name of that service that maps the emails to the social media?
Rapleaf is one of them, and I know there are some other competitors. But
Flowtown, another one maybe?
Yeah, Flowtown does that too. They're a little bit more expensive, but they do, but they provide kind of some other features as well. But yeah, definitely Flowtown. Thanks. And let's see, any other questions on this? Yeah.
So in terms to do with kind of both of these talks, it seems very scientific. You kind of work your way through it. You're constantly improving, etc. It can't be that every business in the world who does this, even every business who does it properly, is going to succeed.
Sure.
So, like, what does it not cover? What aspects of getting something going do you kind of have to deal with in some other way?
Well, I mean, so fundamentally, the whole lean startup customer development is just like any methodology, like Agile, Scrum, anything else. They can help you identify the right success metrics and help you measure them and continuously improve towards them, but they don't replace. I mean, they don't guarantee success. I'll come out and say that. So if you think that just by following Agile you're going to create a successful product, obviously we know that's silly. And so it's the same thing applies here. Essentially, what it lets you do is have a strong vision about what you want that product to be, and then use iterations or use experiments to help test parts of those parts of that vision. And it could very well be that vision was just way off. And Eric Ries kind of has one of his quotes that say, startups that succeed are those that manage to iterate the most time before running out of resources. So if your vision is wrong, what you end up doing is figuring out that it's wrong, refining it, and then trying again. Most people don't have infinite time to keep iterating, and so at some point you either run out of resources or you figure out that this was just a flawed vision. So there is no guarantee of success there.
So like in usability, sometimes we did like usability on paper. Do you do any kind of, prior to getting to this, cycling with back of the napkin ideas and doing testing of that?
Sure, no, absolutely. So there's a whole, so even prior to building anything, there are lots of ways that you can go and test ideas. Usually it's more kind of in the vein of testing the problem first. So you want to make sure that the problems that you're really trying to address are real problems worth solving. And once you kind of get that level, once there's that pain point where the customer says, yes, I'm motivated enough to have you build a solution for me, almost the next step there is to show them some kind of a mock-up or a screenshot or even a wireframe. I mean, you can get very creative there, a slideshow. But the idea there again is to make sure that the way that you're going to solve that solution is actually going to solve the problem that they have. And there many companies, and Food on the Table is one of them, that actually didn't even start with the software solution. They pretty much provided a kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, but it was kind of an in-person delivered grocery list to their early customers, and then over time figured out what parts they needed to automate, and so where software was needed.
We should probably wrap it.
Okay, this is the last slide. So I was just going to end by saying that of kind of all the techniques, the thing that we found kind of most effective was being able to message users at the right time. So I mentioned before that once they hit a particular point where they're unhappy, where there's a cliff, there's a timer that's set where their motivation starts diminishing very, very quickly. So being able to message them very quickly was very important. And so with the system that we built, we were able to track some of the types of behaviors they were doing in the application. And then in the beginning, we were just watching those and manually sending out these emails, and then that became hard to do. So that started getting automated, hardwired into the application, to where now we're using it for many other things than just some of the troubleshooting. Now we actually use it more for even marketing. So if we have a new feature that's coming out on the Mac, we can send out an email just to those sets of users and highlight that particular feature just to them. So it's a very targeted type of campaigning system at this point. And yeah, that's the last slide. I guess the whole, basically the ending point here is that you have to tackle the whole product. It's not just about code and features. And understanding how users behave and understanding how users approach your product is kind of key to be able to build things that they want.